9 winters in her father-in-law's house without a coat. A Lakota chief wrapped her in fur. The first thing I noticed was her boots. Not her face. Not the way she stood apart from the other women at the edge of the cooking fire. The boots. Cracked at the toe, the left sole lifting away at the heel where the stitching had failed 2 seasons ago at least, held now by nothing except habit and the cold pressing them flat against the ground. I had been watching those boots for 9 winters without knowing it. You see a thing long enough without seeing it, and then one morning the light shifts and you see nothing else. Her name was Clara. My son Chask had brought her back from a trading settlement on the Cheyenne River in the autumn of his 22nd year, pale-haired, with a straight back and eyes that took in everything without comment. The other women in camp had expected her to be soft. They had expected her to cry for her mother's house and refuse the work. She didn't do any of that. She learned to scrape a hide in the first month. She learned enough of the language by the second winter that she could argue a price at the trading post, which made the men respect her, though not in any way they would have said aloud. What she did not learn, and what no one thought to give her, was how to make herself a coat. There are things the women of a band teach their own daughters, knowledge that passes in the way heat passes from stone to stone, by contact, by nearness, by someone taking your hands in theirs and guiding them. Clara was not anyone's daughter here. She was a daughter-in-law, which is a thing that sits at the edge of a fire rather than inside it. She had come into the camp on the arm of Chask, and Chask's mother, my wife Wachui, had died the winter before he brought her home. There was no woman whose obligation it was to teach her the deep things. The other women were not unkind, but kindness and obligation are not the same, and they did not go out of their way to thread her into the knowledge of how we kept ourselves alive in cold country. So she made do. She layered what she had: a wool blanket from the trading post, a man's overshirt Chask gave her, a pair of thick-knit stockings that she was perpetually darning. She was never the woman who stood by the fire complaining. She moved fast to stay warm. In the hardest weeks of the deep cold moons she stayed near the lodge as much as she could. She did not ask. I watched this from where I sat, which is the place a chief sits, at the edge of everything, close enough to see, far enough to not be in it. My son was not a negligent man. He loved Clara, but he was young and certain the way young men are certain, and I think he did not see the boots because he did not know what it meant to look at a woman and see what was lacking rather than only what was there. 9 winters. I want you to hold that number for a moment. Not 9 days, not 9 weeks. 9 winters on the northern plains, in a camp that moved 4 times a year and built no permanent walls, where the cold came in earnest in the moon of falling leaves and did not properly release its grip until past the moon when geese return. 9 winters of making do with a trader's blanket and a dead man's boots. I need to go back to tell you about the morning I finally moved, but first I need to tell you about Wachui, because Wachui is part of why it took me 9 years to do what I should have done in 9 weeks. She was my wife for 31 years. We were married in the old way, with horses and ceremony, in the summer I was 21, when she was 17, and already the kind of woman who made other women pay attention. Not because she was beautiful, though she was, because she saw. She had eyes that found the thing beneath the thing, the woman who was not actually well, the child who was not actually eating, the man whose pride was covering something that would eventually destroy him. She saw these things and she moved quietly to address them, not with speeches but with a piece of meat here, a lesson there, a coat laid at the right person's feet at the right time, a hand on a shoulder in the dark. I was a man who made decisions. Wachui was a woman who made things livable. These are not the same job, and neither is less than the other. When she died of fever in the moon of popping trees, swift and merciless the way cold fevers are, I buried her properly and I grieved her properly, and then I went about being the chief this band needed. I held the band together through the next winter, which was bad, and the next summer, which brought trouble with the crow in the eastern range, and the winter after that, which took 3 of the older people and left everyone diminished. I did my job. What I did not do was pick up the seeing that Wachui had put down when she died. I told myself it was not my work, that the women of the band would take it up as they always had. That the seeing and tending was a particular knowledge that passed among women and did not require my interference. I was a chief. I read land and weather and other men's intentions. I made decisions about where the camp would winter and when we would move and how we would respond to what the world was doing to us. I fed people. I protected people. What I did not do, and I see this now with the clear, cold vision that comes to a man when he has stopped excusing himself, was look at the individual women of my own camp with the eyes Wachui had. Not at any of them, but most completely not at Clara. Because Clara made it easy not to look. She was capable, she was quiet, she never presented a problem. She simply endured in her methodical, unbothered way. And I, who prided myself on seeing, saw her capability and called it fine and looked elsewhere. The morning I finally moved was in the 11th month of Clara's 9th winter in our camp. The snow had come early and heavy that year, the kind of snow that falls without wind and makes the whole world go the color of a closed eye. It was not yet past the middle of the morning, and already the light had that flat, finished quality that means more snow is building behind the first. I had come out of my lodge to check the horses. There was one with a left front hock that had been running warm for 3 days, and I wanted to look at it again in the light. I moved past the cooking area. The fire was going well. Maka, the oldest woman in camp, was in charge of the morning cooking and had been since before I was chief and would be until she died, and she ran the morning fire with an efficiency that meant there was always something hot before full light. A few people were moving around it. I went past, and I saw Clara at the far edge of camp, looking east. She stood there the way she sometimes stood, not homesick. I had come to understand over the years, but attentive, the way a person listens when they hear something they can't quite name. She had the blanket pulled around her shoulders, but the wind had gotten under one side of it, and she was holding the edge at her throat with one fist, not pulling it closed so much as pressing it there. Her breath was a steady cloud in the cold air. Her feet were in those boots. Her ears were bare and the cold had worked on them till they were the color of the inside of a plum. She was holding herself still with the particular stillness of someone who is cold and has decided not to let the cold win, but it is winning anyway. I stopped. I stood there in the snow and I looked at her. And for the first time in 9 winters, I actually looked. Not the way you glance at something you have already categorized. The way you look when you are finally willing to see. The boots. The wool blanket held at the throat. The bare ears. The 9 winters. I went back into my lodge. I have a coat that was made for me the winter I turned 38, the year I became chief of this band. It was made from a wolf taken on the high plains, the biggest wolf I had ever seen taken, silver along the spine, the fur so deep you could put your whole hand into it up to the wrist and feel nothing cold. Wachui made it. She spent the better part of 2 months on it, working in the evenings after everything else was done, working with the precision she brought to everything she built. The stitching at the collar is her work, small and even and tight as woven grass. I have worn it every winter since. I wear it when I meet with other chiefs. I wear it when there is something that needs to be said by how a man stands. I took it off the peg and I carried it outside. She was still at the edge of camp. She hadn't moved. The snow had started again, dry and fine, and it was settling on the blanket at her shoulders, on her pale hair, on those ruined boots. The cold had hold of this morning and meant to keep it. I walked across the camp to where she stood and I came up beside her, and I did not say anything for a moment. I just stood next to her and looked east the way she was looking. The plains went flat and white all the way to where the sky came down, and you couldn't tell anymore where one ended and the other began. She sensed me and turned. Her face was wind-colored and her eyes were steady. She looked at the coat in my hands and then she looked at me, and she understood, I could see her understand, that this was not a casual thing. She was a woman who understood the weight of objects. She reached out and touched the collar just lightly with 2 fingers, feeling the fur, feeling the stitching. She said, in her careful Lakota, it had gotten very good by then, better than some people who had grown up hearing it. She said, "Are you certain you want me to have this?" I said, "I am not giving it to you." She waited. She had learned over 9 winters in my son's house that I did not speak the way some men spoke, to fill space, to hear my own voice. She had learned to wait for the second thing. I said, "I am putting it on you. That is different." And I unfolded the coat and I put it around her shoulders myself, the way you put a thing around someone you are claiming in front of whatever is watching. Not rough, not ceremonial either, not with any performance. Just settled it on her, adjusted it at the collar so it lay properly, smoothed the front where it had bunched. My wife stitching under my hands. The wolf coat was long and it came nearly to Clara's boots, and when I settled it fully on her, she seemed to disappear into it a little. And then she straightened her back, the way she always did, and it fit her better than I had expected. She put her hands through the front opening and held them inside the fur, and I watched her close her eyes. The wind moved around us. The snow fell. Behind us the camp went on, women moving, smoke rising from the lodges, a child calling out somewhere in the white distance, the life of the place. When she opened her eyes she said, still in Lakota, "I have been cold for a long time." "I know," I said. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said softly, "Chask doesn't." And I said, "Not his fault. He didn't know what he didn't see, neither did I for too long." She turned and looked at me directly when I said that last part. It is not a thing a Lakota chief says easily, that he did not see. She received it the way she received most things, without drama, without making more of it than it was. She said, "I loved Wachui's stories about you." I said, "Chask told you stories?" She said, "Not Chask. Old Maka used to tell them when she thought I wasn't listening well enough to understand. She told them to the other women while they were working." She would say, and Clara's Lakota shifted register slightly here, took on Maka's particular rhythm, she would say, "He is not a man who makes gestures. When he acts it means something has been settled." I looked at my daughter-in-law in my dead wife's coat. I said, "Maka has known me for 50 years. Clara said, "Yes, she told me that too." We stood there a little while longer. The cold was still the cold, but she was inside the fur now and her ears were covered by the collar, and I could see the tight holding of her face had loosened, not dramatically, not tears or any demonstration, just the easing of a person who has been braced against something for a very long time and has finally been permitted to set that bracing down. That was the moment. I want to be precise about it because I have thought about it many times in the years since. Not the putting on of the coat, not the first word I said to her. That moment, her face, easing, the slow release of 9 winters of cold. That was what I should have done in 9 weeks, and I had taken 9 years. There are things a man carries, and they are not always the things other people can see. We came back from the edge of camp and walked together through the center toward the main fire. The coat was known in this camp. Every person in it knew that coat. I had worn it since before some of these people had their adult teeth. And a camp sees everything. People glanced and then looked again, and I watched understanding move through the faces. I passed the way light moves through water. Maka was at the fire. She was a small woman. She had always been small, though she seemed to take up the space of a much larger person, and she had a piece of mending in her lap and her eyes were on it, or appeared to be. She watched us come with the kind of not watching that is its own form of watching. She looked at the coat. She looked at me. She said, in a voice that was not loud but was meant to carry exactly as far as it needed to, "That is a warm coat." I said, "Yes, she has needed one for some time." Maka's face moved, very slightly. She said nothing more and went back to her mending. But it was done. The quality of the air around that fire had shifted. I felt it the way you feel a change in weather, in the body before the mind can name it. Clara poured herself a cup of the morning's broth and sat down at the fire, and she was inside the coat with her shoulders down away from her ears for the first time in 9 winters that I had watched, and no one said anything to her, but no one moved away from her either, and that was the thing that had been different before. The small, cold inches of space that had always been maintained around her, the distance that was not quite exclusion and not quite belonging, that space was gone. Maka came to the fire about 10 minutes later, sat down across from us. She did not look at Clara and she did not look at me, and after a minute she put her hand into the pouch at her belt where she kept the dried meat she reserved for her grandchildren, and she took out a piece, and she passed it across the fire without ceremony, set it on the ground at Clara's side. Clara looked at it. She looked at Maka. Maka was examining the steam coming off her broth. Clara picked up the meat. She said in very quiet, very careful Lakota, "Thank you, grandmother." Maka said, "You need more fat on you for this cold." She said it as a complaint, as a woman correcting a person who has been careless about something they should not have been careless about. "You need more fat on you for this cold," the way you might say you should have been wearing better boots. Which Clara had been trying to tell us for 9 years, in her silent way. And we hadn't been giving her the fat, or the boots, or the coat. I looked at the fire. I am not a man whose face moves much. My face was not moving, but there was something happening behind it that I will not try to describe except to say that it involved Wachui, and old Maka, and this pale-haired woman who had arrived on my son's arm and quietly spent 9 winters earning a place that should have simply been given, and the wolf coat around her shoulders, and the piece of dried meat on the ground beside her. I am 64 years old as I tell you this. I have been chief of this band for 26 years. I have made decisions I would make again, and decisions that wake me some nights. I have buried my wife and my brother and 11 men who rode with me in the bad years, and I have brought my band through things that should have finished us. I know what it is to hold something together by will and weather, and the refusal to stop. What I did that morning was not holding something together. It was something simpler and harder. It was admitting that something had been broken, quietly, for 9 winters, and that the breaking was mine to own. My son's fault for not seeing. My camp's fault for not opening. But mine most of all because I was the one with the eyes. I had Wachui's eyes. I had just not been willing to use them on this particular person, and I had let a good woman stand in the cold. Chask found me that afternoon, checking the horse with the warm hock. He stood beside me for a while not saying anything. We are alike in that we come to things through silence. Finally he said I should have seen it. I said you saw her, you chose her, that's not nothing. He looked at the ground. He said she is strong. I said yes. He said she is strong the way mother was strong. I looked at my son then. He was 29, broader in the shoulders than I had been at his age, with his mother's way of going very still when something mattered to him. He was looking at me with an expression that was not looking for reassurance. He was just looking at his father, measuring something. I said, your mother would have had that coat on her inside the first month. Chask said yes, she would have. We stood there with the horse between us and the snow still coming down. After a while he said, will you eat with us tonight? I said I would. He put his hand on my shoulder briefly. Just once, just for a moment, the way men do when they don't want to make more of something than it is, and then he went back toward the lodge. I finished with the horse. The hock was a little better, not well yet but better. Some things take time to heal, and the work while they're healing is just to keep them from getting worse. I have found this to be true of horses and of many other things. I walked back through the camp in the late afternoon, the snow still coming down soft and steady. The lodges had their smoke going and the light inside them was amber and warm, and showed through the skins in these small blurs of light, like the camp was something breathing. At the lodge my son shared with Clara, I could smell something cooking, something with dried prairie turnip in it that had been reconstituting all day. the sweet, earthy smell of it. I could hear Clara inside talking to someone, a neighbor woman who had stopped by, and the woman was laughing at something Clara had said. I stood outside for a moment in the snow. I am not going to tell you I had a thought that was big and clear and complete. Thoughts like that are for stories that are neater than life. What I had was the smell of the turnip and the sound of my daughter-in-law making a woman laugh and the coat on her back, my wife's work, my wolf, and the knowing that Maka had given her the dried meat, and that tomorrow I was going to talk to two of the women who were best at coat making and arrange for Clara to spend the winter learning properly. That was what I was thinking. The next thing after 9 years of the wrong thing. There are men who are talkers, who make their lives make sense by telling them to other people. I am not that kind. What I know in my body, in my hands, in the way I stand in a particular cold, in what I do when the moment comes. I stood in the snow outside my son's lodge, and I knew that I had done the thing I was supposed to do, finally, and that it had cost nothing except my own reluctance, and that the reluctance had been the only thing it cost. And I went inside. Clara was sitting close to the fire with the wolf coat still on her shoulders and the neighbor woman beside her, and the turnip smell was stronger inside, and the lodge was warm. Clara looked up when I came in. She was holding a cup of something, warming her hands on it, and she looked at me with those straight, steady eyes, the color of winter sky. She didn't say anything. She just moved to the left, giving me room at the fire. I sat down. Outside the snow was still coming, filling in the tracks we'd made. The cold was doing what cold does. But inside the fire was good, and my daughter-in-law was warm, and the neighbor woman was still talking. And after a while Chask came in, stomping the snow off his boots, and he sat down beside his wife without looking at me but close enough that his shoulder touched mine briefly. The turnip was ready. We ate. I want to tell you something about the coat. Not about that morning. About later. About what happened to it over the years that followed, because things that matter to people accumulate their own history, and the coat is no different. Clara wore it through that winter and the next and the one after, and it became hers the way things become a person's when they are used hard and cared for well. She oiled the leather backing when it dried. She restitched one seam at the left sleeve with the same small tight stitch that Wachui had used, a stitch she had not been taught but had studied carefully from the original work and taught herself. That took her 2 evenings, and when she was done, the new stitching was almost indistinguishable from the old. In the 3rd winter after I gave it to her, I say now, though I said at the time I was putting it on her, and both things were true, she had a daughter. The baby came in the moon of popping trees, which was the same moon Wachui had died in, which is the kind of thing that does not mean anything and means everything simultaneously depending on the hour you consider it in. Clara labored hard and long, and in the night when it was finally done Chask came to find me with a face like a man who has just survived something that nearly killed him by arriving near enough, and he said, "A girl. They are both well." I went to the lodge in the early morning dark. Clara was lying with the baby on her chest, and she had the wolf coat spread over both of them, not wearing it exactly, just pulled over them like a second skin. The baby was a small, fierce thing, dark-haired like Chask, and she had her eyes open already, which the women said was a sign of particular willfulness, and I did not doubt it given whose daughter she was. Clara looked at me over the baby's head and she said, "We want to name her Wachui." I sat with that for a moment. I said, "That is a good name." Clara said, quietly, "I know some of what it means to do without a mother in this place. I want her to always have the name of one." I looked at my granddaughter. The fire in the lodge was low, that gray hour before someone feeds it, and the light was just enough. The child's eyes were dark and open, and they moved across my face the way a new person's eyes move, making their first assessments of the world. I put one finger on the back of her hand, very lightly, the way you test whether a thing is real. She curled her fingers around mine. Some things you cannot prepare for. Some things arrive and there is no wisdom you have accumulated and no experience that constitutes adequate preparation. You just meet them. I said she has good hands. Clara made a sound that was almost a laugh, tired and genuine. She said, she has been using them to kick me for 3 months. I stayed a while. I did not stay long, it was Clara's time, and the child's and Chask's, and I was not the center of it and did not try to be. But I stayed while the light came up and the fire was fed and the morning began, and I held my granddaughter once briefly, while Clara slept for the first time in what must have been 2 days, and I held her the way you hold something you did not expect and cannot now imagine having been without. I am telling this badly, maybe. I am not a man whose life makes itself into a clean telling. What I mean to say is this. There was a morning when I looked at a woman who had been cold for 9 winters and I finally saw her, and I put my coat on her shoulders, and what came from that one morning? The crack it made in the camp's fixed opinion of her, the shift in her standing, the slow warming that followed in the months and years after. It grew into things I could not have anticipated when I was standing at the edge of camp in the new snow. You do not see what a thing will become when you do it. You only see what is in front of you, a woman who has been cold, a coat, the next right thing. That is all you ever have. My granddaughter is 5 years old now, a dark-haired particular child who has opinions about everything and a laugh like her father's when he was small, and has already, at 5, beaten the cook fire once with a pot lid to make a sound she liked, and dragged the camp's most ill-tempered dog 300 yards by its scruff without getting bitten, which is either fearlessness or poor judgment or both. The women in camp adore her. Maka, who is very old now and moves slowly and spends most of her days close to the fire, keeps a piece of dried meat in her pouch specifically for Wachui, and the child knows this and visits with a regularity that is not entirely about the affection. Clara wears the coat still. She has put 3 winters of her own work into it now, the restitching, a patch on the right shoulder where the backing had cracked, new thonging at the closures. It is still recognizably Wachui's work, and it is also recognizably hers, and this seems to me like the right outcome for a coat that has been well used and well kept. We do not speak about that morning much. We do not speak much at all in the way I mean the big explaining kind of talk, the talk where you name what things meant. It is not our way, and it was not Clara's way even before she came to us. But there are small things. She brings me a cup of something hot when the mornings are coldest, without being asked. She sits near me at ceremonies, not at the back of the family the way she once would have positioned herself, but beside me, shoulder to shoulder, which is a thing a daughter-in-law does when she is sure of her place, and her place is sure of her. Last winter, the worst we'd had in 10 years, the kind of cold that makes the rivers stop and the birds go silent. She came to find me one evening near the middle of the hard cold moon. She had the coat on and she was carrying a second one over her arm, one she had made herself over the previous season, elk hide and rabbit fur lining, small and even stitches at the collar. She held it out to me. She said, "You have been wearing that old one with the split at the cuff for 3 winters. I kept waiting for you to say something about it." I looked at the coat she was holding. I said, "I don't notice cold the way I used to." She said, "I know." She said it the way Wachui used to say things, not unkindly, not with impatience, just with the plain certainty of someone telling you a fact about yourself that you have been declining to acknowledge. I took the coat. The stitching at the collar was small and even and tight. She had learned it from studying Wachui's work, from those winters of looking carefully at the original, and she had made it her own, and now she was making me something in it, the way the women of this band make things for the people they have decided are theirs. I put it on. She stood there and watched me settle it on my shoulders, and when it was on she reached up and adjusted the collar, two-handed, the way you would for someone you were sending into cold, making sure the neck was covered. Her hands were quick and sure. She said, "Better." I said, "Yes." She went back toward the lodge. I stood outside a moment in the cold, in the coat my daughter-in-law had made me in the dark, with the stars very bright above the camp the way they get when the temperature falls and the air goes thin and clear. The lodges had their fires. The smoke went straight up in the still air. My granddaughter was in there, almost certainly still awake despite everyone's best efforts, because she was that kind of child. I thought about that morning 9 winters ago. The flat white light, the snow falling, those boots. A man lives his life, and sometimes he does the thing he should have done far sooner, and the lateness of it is part of what he has to carry, and you carry it and you keep going, and you try to see better and sooner the next time. That is what there is. You do not get to go back and be the man who acted in 9 weeks instead of 9 years. You get to be the man who finally acted, and you get to see what grows from it. What grew from it is in that lodge. What grew from it wears my wife's coat and makes me something in the stitching my wife used. What grew from it is a dark-haired 5-year-old who grabs dogs by the scruff and beats pots and has her grandmother's name. It grew well, better than I deserved for waiting as long as I did. The cold was coming down hard, but I was warm. I went inside. There are things about leading a band that people outside it do not understand, and one of those things is that the chief is always the last to receive and the first to give. I do not say this as complaint. It is the shape of the job, and I chose the job, and I do not regret it. But it means that the ordinary tenderness of being cared for, the thing that a wife does, or a mother, the person who notices before you do that you are worn or cold or carrying something that is starting to cost you, that thing goes when the woman who did it is gone. Wachui noticed everything about me. She noticed when my knee hurt before I was willing to admit it. She noticed when a decision was weighing on me and I had not yet spoken it into words. She noticed when I had not eaten enough at a meal because my mind was elsewhere. She did not make demonstrations about these things. She put food in front of me. She rubbed the knee with the preparation she made from beaver oil and a plant she gathered in the summer mountains. She lay awake with me on the nights the decisions would not resolve themselves, not talking, just there. When she died, I did not expect anyone to do these things. I was the chief. I was 60 years old. I had run this band through worse than a dead wife, though a dead wife is its own kind of worse, particular and private. I expected nothing, and nothing was mostly what I received, which was correct and appropriate, and also its own kind of cold that I did not spend much time examining. And then slowly, without my noticing when it started, the small things began. A cup of something hot on the worst mornings, not every morning, the mornings when the cold was deepest, when frost sat on the inside of the lodge skins and even the fire needed coaxing. A cup left near where I would sit when I came out of sleep. Clara's doing I knew because of the mint she put in it, a habit she had carried from her mother's house and that no one else in camp used. I said nothing about it. I did not know for a while whether she knew I knew it was her. She knew, she just was not making it a thing that required acknowledgement. She brought me once, only once, but once is enough, a piece of work that one of my horses had done to his bridle, a knotting of the throat strap that I could not get out with my fingers in the cold and had set aside in frustration. She brought it back to me 2 days later undone, the strap hanging free, the knot gone. She set it on the ground beside me and went about her business. I held the bridle for a moment, thinking about how she had done it. Her hands were smaller than mine and she had worked at it with something, a thin bone tool from her sewing, probably, working the knot loose with patience I had not had. She had seen me put it aside in frustration 2 days earlier. She had picked it up. She had done it quietly, without mention. These are small things. I know they are small things, but I had been a man receiving nothing for 3 years, and small things land differently on a person who has been receiving nothing. I think about Maka, who I have known for 50 years. Maka has strong opinions about who is good and who is not, and she holds them longer than weather. She had decided early on that Clara was a coldness in the camp's heart, not from cruelty, not from meanness, but from a real fear, from the way the world was pressing in on us from every side, and Clara was a visible point of that pressure. The decision was wrong, but it was not incomprehensible. What changed it was not argument and not time and not anything Clara did, finally. What changed it was me. A coat and an old chief putting it on a woman in front of the camp, and then sitting beside her at the fire, and making plain by his sitting that this was not a moment but a position. I have been told by men who study these things, who come from the eastern settlements and want to know how bands are led, that a chief's power comes from his warriors, from the men who will fight for him. I tell them, yes and also no. The warriors matter, but a band is mostly not warriors. A band is women and children and old people and the middle ones, the workers and the hunters and the quiet majority who get up every morning and do what needs doing. And in a band, the chief's power is partly ceremony and partly real decision-making, and partly, this is the part the Eastern men do not understand, partly the power of being watched. Everything a chief does is watched and weighed: where he sits, what he eats first, who he speaks to, what he lets pass without comment. All of it is information, and the band reads it the way you read a sky, continuously, without effort for the implications. When I put that coat on Clara's shoulders and walked with her back through the center of the camp, I was doing something that was not neutral. I was making a declaration by my body and by the coat and by the walking. I was saying, this woman is under my protection and she is of my family, and if you have had questions about that, let the questions be done. The band read it, as I knew they would, as I intended them to. But here is the thing I have thought about in the years since. In the planning of it, in the decision that morning to carry the coat out, I was thinking of the camp. I was thinking of the old women's opinion and of Maka's weight and of what my walking would say. I was a chief thinking about the band. What I was not thinking about, and what turned out to be the thing that mattered most, was Clara. Not the camp's view of Clara, Clara herself. The woman who had been cold for 9 winters and who had asked for nothing and who pressed the blanket against her throat every morning and kept moving. I was not thinking, primarily, about what she needed. I was thinking about what needed to be done. I put the coat on her for the right reasons and also partially for the wrong ones. And then she said, I have been cold for a long time, and looked at me with those winter sky eyes, and I understood that whatever I had been thinking about, what was actually happening was simpler and older than any of it. A person had been cold. I had something warm. That was the whole of it. The chief thinking fell away. I was just a man who had waited too long to do a simple thing. I have turned this over many times in the years since. The self I am, deliberate, political, accustomed to thinking several steps ahead, had calculated the coat, had understood its value as a statement. That is not wrong. It is in fact the kind of thinking that keeps a band alive. But the calculation had also kept me from acting for 4 years while I waited for the moment to be right, when the moment had been right every morning for 4 years, and I simply had not let myself see it. What I am trying to say is that sometimes a man overcomplicates his own goodness, uses the thinking that is usually a strength as a way of not doing the thing, tells himself he is being strategic when he is being slow. I am 64 years old and I have been doing the thing I am best at, holding back, assessing, choosing the moment for long enough that I know where it fails me. It fails me when the right thing is just the right thing and does not need to be timed. Clara has never in the years since referred to any of this. She has not said, I am glad you did it, or I wish you had done it sooner, or any of the things a different woman might have felt the need to say. She just moved forward from it, the way she moved forward from everything, without dwelling, without narrative, with her eyes already on the next thing that needed doing. I respect that more than I can easily say. The women who have mattered to me in my life, Wachui and now Clara, and in a different way Maka, who is so old now that she has moved past opinion into something more like weather, they all share this quality. They do not need the story of themselves. They just do the thing and move on. They leave the story making to the men, who apparently need it more. I am the one sitting here telling you all this. My granddaughter Wachui will be 6 in the spring. She has already decided she will be a healer, based on evidence that includes an interest in the medicine bundles that border on the intrusive, a habit of testing her treatments on the camp's dogs without permission, and a general conviction that she knows what is wrong with people before they do. The healer woman, Old Hinhin, thinks she is a pest. She has also in the last year started teaching her things. I consider this to be settled. The child does not remind me of her grandmother in the ways I expected. She does not have Wachui's quietness or her patience or her particular quality of stillness. She is loud and fast and relentless and exhausting, but she has the seeing. Even at 5, nearly 6, she notices the person at the edge of the fire who has not been brought a cup of something. She notices the horse that is favoring a leg. She will go sit beside the old people who are having harder days without anyone telling her to, and she will just sit there, not performing comfort, just being there the way Wachui was just there. She got it from Clara, I think. Who got it from no one in this camp, she came with it. Who may have gotten it from the 9 winters of being the one at the edge of the fire who had not been brought a cup, and so learning in her bones what that felt like, and not wanting to let it happen to anyone else. Pain teaches things that comfort cannot sometimes. I am not glad she was cold for 9 winters. I am not saying it was good that the camp's opinion sat on her like a stone for all those years. But she is who she is, partly because of what she endured and how she endured it. There is no unknotting that. The world comes for all of us in different ways. What I know is that she is warm now, that she has been warm for 6 years, that my wife's stitching is on her back and her own stitching is on mine, that my granddaughter has her name who has the eyes. That is what I know, that is what I hold. The rest is wind.